Hi, everyone. Are we live? See, I'm always a little. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the science fiction versus fantasy panel. We're here to discuss definitions of fantasy versus science fiction, where there is overlap, where science fantasy fits in terms of the whole subgenres of speculative fiction. And I am currently, I have to go mute myself. So now, I'm really excited about this panel, I'm excited about QuaranCon. Please visit www.QuaranCon2020.com for the full schedule of events. We have a full exciting weekend full of readings, panels, workshops, contest announcements. On Monday, there will be a contest announcement for all of our winners, and a goat is going to eat the winner of our mini Bulwer Lytton contest live. So we're very excited about that. I can't wait for that one. And I also visit the Artist Alley at QuaranCon2020.com. Lots of cool things that you can find there. And there's also a sale going on. Many of the authors involved in this panel also have their books on sale for 99 cents, and you can find the link on that website. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to introduce my fabulous panel that I'm super excited are all here, and I'm going to start with Joyce. So Joyce, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Joyce Hertzoff. I had a long career in the scientific publishing business before I retired, and that's when I first started to write nonfiction. And I always loved fantasy, always loved science fiction, and I wanted to get into that. I have published a 4-book series called The Crystal Odyssey, and I have an award-winning novella called A Bite of the Apple, as well as a kid's book called So You Want to Be a Dragon. I do facilitating and mentoring at Writers Village University, which is an online school, and I'm a member of Southwest Writers.
Awesome, thank you.
Maddie. And I live in New Mexico.
Oh, Maddie, do you want to introduce yourself? Can you hear us? Maddie's having a little technical trouble, so let's go on. Oh, there she is.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I'm here now. Yeah, hopefully my internet will hold up for this, but it's been a bit wobbly. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Madeline Dyer. I write young adult dystopian and science fiction. I'm the author of the Untamed series, a book one of which won the 2017 Seeb Award for Best Dystopian. Here it is. And yeah, I also write YA thrillers set in sort of speculative futuristic worlds as well. So sort of like where science fiction merges with contemporary. And yeah, my day job is I work as an editor. So that's me.
Awesome. Okay, Darren, how about you?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Darren Hanshaw. I'm a science fiction fantasy author. I wrote a book called The Engineer, which is a sci-fi book that takes place actually in Redemption, which I'm in right now, which is a futuristic city that's been completely destroyed. So I'm currently working on my second book, and I've also got a short story out through the Sci-Fi Roundtable. So I've got my Night of the Sci-Fi Roundtable shirt on, which is a Facebook group I think Joyce is a part of as well.
Yes.
So check that out if you're interested in this topic. We talk a lot about that. In my day job, I'm a R&D engineer, so I get to invent a lot of cool things with optomechanics. And at nights, I work as a volunteer fire chief for my local fire department. So in between all that time and being married and having a little 4-year-old son, I try to find time to write at least once a week to make progress on my novels. So awesome. Thanks for having me here.
Awesome. Alex, go ahead.
Hello, thanks for having me. My name is Alex Darwin. I'm the author of the Combat Code series. It's a martial arts heavy action series, and it's currently a finalist in the SPFBO Mark Lawrence's fantasy competition, and it's caused a little bit, I wouldn't say, maybe a little bit of controversy with the judges, because it is a fantasy competition, and some are saying perhaps it's a science fiction book. So I'll get into that, I'm sure, a little bit more about my thoughts on it. And I guess, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I know Amanda invited me, from my perspective on that. So thank you for having me.
All right, Cavan, how about you?
Oh, hi there. Thanks for having me as well. My name's Cavan Scott. I'm a comics writer and a author over here in the UK. For the last 20 years, I've written for primarily some well-known franchises like Doctor Who, Pacific Rim, Ghostbusters, Transformers, Back to the Future. And at the minute, I'm probably best known for my work on a new project from Lucasfilm called Star Wars: The High Republic, which is a big multimedia event. I've been working on one of the 5 story architects for that, and I write the Marvel comic series for that as well. And I have the next book coming up from Del Rey, Star Wars: The High Republic, The Rising Storm, probably too long a title, which is coming out in June later this year.
That's so exciting. That is really cool. I love everything you work on. And Pacific Rim is one of my favorite movies. So
There we go.
I love that movie. I'm Amanda Justice. I write, I'm a novelist. I'm also, in my day job, I'm a science and medical writer. I have a series of novels that are set called the Wern Saga, that are, it's a science fantasy kind of in the mode of Anne McCaffrey's Pern series, in that it's has all of the trappings of fantasy, but it is very clearly set as in a lost space colony. So all of the human occupants of the world, there's knowledge that they came from another planet called Earth, and the indigenous animals are completely alien. So anyhow, so this is like my favorite topic, and I am actually going to start with a question that Darren's applied, which I thought was a really, really good question for this. Is the old quote from, was it Asimov, that said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sufficiently advanced technology, there's, you can't tell the difference between that and magic, and I'm obviously paraphrasing. So where do you all think, like, how does that quote fit, and how does that cover the genre, the spectrum between science fiction and fantasy, if we think of the speculative fiction as a genre that spans that thing? So I'm gonna go to Cavan first with that.
Well, it's interesting you say spectrum, because that's exactly how I think about this. For me, science fiction and fantasy are the same. They're just different wallpapers, different desktop patterns of the same kind of story. It's just the tools are different. I suppose it helps because the two things I've written most in my career are Star Wars and Doctor Who, which in my mind are never really science fiction. They're absolutely science fantasy, and both involve space wizards of various forms. And yeah, for me, both genres just dealing with how we affect the environment and how the environment affects us. And it depends where they're set, whether we decide they're science fiction or fantasy, because the rules both have rules, both have systems to work. I think the further you get down the fantasy route and you get into horror, that's when perhaps the explanations start to vanish and have to vanish because of what you're writing. But again, I think the spectrum, it all depends on how much explanation you're putting on the system, and that perhaps says whether it's science fiction or fantasy, because of that quote. Absolutely. Again, some of my experience working on Doctor Who, the TARDIS is technically a spaceship. It's technically science fiction. The Doctor understands it. No one else who steps on board does. It's bigger on the inside because of something to do with transcendental dimensionalism, or it's just a wardrobe where there's Narnia
hand
inside.
waving magic.
Yeah, exactly. And the Jedi are have a connection to the Force because of midichlorians, or perhaps just because it's in all of us. And so it depends. Again, it depends on the story you're trying to tell,
Right.
depending on how much you want to get involved. And so, yeah, that's always been my take on it. So, yeah, I'm a useless person on this discussion because I'm just saying they're the same thing, basically.
Joyce, you have a science background. What do you think?
Yeah, I have to have an explanation for everything that happens, and that anything in the fantasy realm, if you go far enough, deeply enough into it, there'll be an explanation. Scientific, well, it could be biological, it could be chemical, but there is an explanation. And so that throws it into science fiction, even though it's fantasy. And I think it depends on the author as to how much how deeply they go one way or the other, how much emphasis they put on those explanations, or whether they stay away from them completely. And if they do, then it can be pure fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what I think. Part of it is my scientific background that makes me think that way.
Yeah.
I don't know that all readers or all writers think that way, but that's how I think.
I'll interject that I agree that I'm in this. I feel exactly the same way you do, and in my own work, I have to provide some kind of even a pseudoscientific explanation for what's going on. So that's the approach that I take. So Maddie, I'm going to get you in here. Well, anytime I see that you're moving, I know that your internet is working.
Yeah. So yeah, I do think of like the two as being very much connected and like a spectrum. And I know when I'm writing, I prefer to sort of like err on the more fantasy side, just because it feels safer that I'm not going to mess up. Because I have not got a scientific background at all. Luckily, one of my best friends is an astrophysicist, so I'm forever sending her messages asking, is this possible? Or if it's not, how can I make this possible? But I just feel safer writing in fantasy worlds because I'm in charge of the rules more there. And I feel that like readers are prepared to suspend more belief for fantasy than for science fiction. So, but yeah, I love reading science fiction, especially when it gets really into sort of like the science of it, and like when you've got all these scientific theories underpinning it. Or but yeah, I know when when I started writing my dystopian series, I did make it dystopian fantasy, so there's like these fantasy elements that are very much part of the world building, and I found that a lot more like freeing for me, and I wasn't quite as worried about writing it because yeah, I am not scientific at all.
Darren, how about you? Where do you stand?
Yeah, so I kind of come across the problem from the other direction, I guess. And as an engineer, I write pretty hard sci-fi explanations behind everything. I really want to justify everything. And I kind of struggled with actually what Alexander had mentioned. Does my novel, I submitted my novel to SPFBO in round 4, actually, and I was a semi-finalist, but I struggled. Is this really a fantasy? Because I'm writing a hard sci-fi. But then I had characters that were fighting with bows and arrows and trying to destroy the technology because they didn't understand it, and they thought it led to the downfall of the city behind me, and some people trying to harness it for power and worshipping it like it was magic. And what I've kind of settled on recently is I think it's more the perspective of the reader that defines the genre. You know, my readers read it, and I think some of them pick out and go, oh, cool, there's some hard sci-fi elements in it. But really, most of them are reading it and they go, oh, this is epic fantasy. You know, there's battles with spears and swords and shields and bows and arrows. And then occasionally somebody pulls out a light lance, you know, and turns it on and obliterates a bunch of people, you know, but there's a hard science explanation behind those things. So yeah, you can play back and forth with both of those elements. And then, you know, with a series like this, you know, or like Anne McCaffrey's Pern, or I got a couple others written down here. The Dying Earth by Jack Vance was a big one. That's an old sci-fi. If you read that, the more you kind of learn about it, the more you think, well, actually, there's a lot of science behind this, and it shifts. It's actually like a shifting from fantasy to sci-fi. And the interesting thing is you could actually go in the opposite direction too. And I think the Expanse does that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the Expanse does that very
Yeah.
much so. And I was really struck by that series, and particularly the early seasons, where there was a lot of mysticism in it. And for me, that's kind of one of the defining elements of it. But I want to get Alex in here, and I want to interject because I invited Alex to this panel specifically because combat codes has been a point of contention among the SPFBO judges about whether or not it's fantasy or science fiction. And I'm on the fantasy faction team of judges, and our group loved that book. We thought it was a great book, but all of us, the consensus is that it's not fantasy. Sorry. So I wanted to bring Alex in to talk about that, and to talk about where he sees those lines between or where you see combat codes specifically, but just literature in general fitting on that spectrum.
Sure. Yeah, and I appreciate you having me here. And yes, I mean, I don't know if I'm here to necessarily like defend I mean, I know it is in a fantasy competition. I'm not necessarily here to defend that position that it's definitely fantasy or not, but along the lines of what some of the other panelists were talking about, I do agree with pretty much everything that's been said. I know that's not a hard line, but as far as it being a spectrum, as Cavan said, I 100% agree. That makes perfect sense to me. I don't see actually how it could not be a spectrum. One side of it you have hard sci-fi, and the other side of it you have Tolkien or just straight swords and sorcery. I think what defines that spectrum to a large extent are tropes that are common, and along the lines of what Darren said, what readers have been exposed to. Again, I really do believe it's both a spectrum and it's defined by the reader, and what tropes in either genre or everywhere in between they've been exposed to. If I asked my mom, what is Star Wars? I think her clear answer, and she's not a big sci-fi or fantasy reader, but of course everyone knows what Star Wars is. I think, and maybe Cavan could correct me, he probably has better experience. Most people would say sci-fi. They certainly wouldn't say science fantasy, because that's such a more specific thing that authors and fantasy and sci-fi nerds know about. But most people would say sci-fi, and if you ask why, they might say something like space or spaceships or laser blasters.
Droids.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And those are just the makings that they've been exposed to over time. So, again, as you get readers and viewers that have been exposed to more of these tropes, they probably are going to have more nuanced views. Now, from my own perspective, I've always been more of a fantasy reader. So I think that's part of what bleeds into combat codes, a lot of those tropes, despite the world being more of like a dystopian world. And one of the common questions from readers that I get is this a galaxy far, far away, or is it a future Earth? And sometimes I say, I don't even know, but I can answer it's not a future Earth, given there's no mention of places on Earth, or even, that word Earth or other planets around Earth. But I actually take a lot more of my inspiration from actually gaming, like RPGs and Japanese RPGs, is particularly like Final Fantasy. And one thing that I've noticed about that, and I think if you've played any of the Final Fantasy games, like Final Fantasy 6 or 3, yep, depending English or Japanese, they have a very seamless blend of tech and magic. And I think because it's gaming, and this is, in the 90s and even 80s, I don't think they were constrained by the same, I don't think they had the same constraints as authors that were already based on, traditional publishing and the marketing genres. And what I understand, you have to have marketing and you have to create genres to target your audiences. But I don't think the gaming community, the game creators were constrained by that. And so you got some really unique creations that were not defined. And again, I think that's part of where combat codes come from. I am heavily influenced by the Final Fantasy series, which doesn't define itself, and it's almost hard to define. It's called Final Fantasy. I don't think people try to define it. They don't say Final Fantasy is fantasy. They just say it's Japanese RPG. That's what it is, and that's its own genre, I guess. So as far as I've gotten both sides, people think it's fantasy. People think Combat Codes is sci-fi. I mean, this sounds like a corny answer, but I think it's what they want it to be. I definitely have sci-fi elements in there. There's technology. I talk about evolution a lot because I'm a big fan of evolution. Even when I read Lord of the Rings, I create an evolutionary backstory in my head, inadvertently. Like, yeah, the elves didn't just appear; they somehow like evolved, and there's like an evolutionary story there. So I think I inadvertently created that in mind. Like, I have a story of how the different races evolved, and that I think people
I can't help doing that too. When I was reading, Song of Ice and Fire, and the never-ending winter that lasts for 100 years or something, and I'm like, how would creatures evolve? How would plant species and life evolve to be able to survive such a prolonged stasis period? So, these are the things that I think about too. I'm wondering if you all think that it's useful to draw a distinction between them. And, Cavan, I'm interested in your perspective on this because you've worked so long on what are considered science fiction television shows. But as you said yourself, they often bridge that gap into the fantasy. So from your experience, do you think that any kind of distinction between the two is a useful thing?
I think it's a marketing thing, definitely. And I think with Star Wars, Lucas completely screwed that within the first sentence of the film a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. A long time ago, fantasy, galaxy far, far away, science fiction. So that just went over everyone's head in the marketing departments. They didn't know what to do with it. I've been really interested in just listening to everyone. And it's what Joyce said about, Joyce comes from a background of science. I come from a background of being a theologian. I've got a theology and mythology degree. So that's what interests me and how we explore the unknown, and so, yeah, I think it's when we're thinking about that spectrum, I think one of the things we look at is the spectrum of explanation, because I think every writer, even if they don't put it on the page, sort of knows how their system works. I mean, every good fantasy novel has a magic system that works because the writer needs those rules. It depends how much you want to put on the page, depending what effect you want on the reader. So cosmic horror is science fiction, but you don't want to explain anything because you want it to be something that's unexplainable. So, and so I've written cosmic horror. I know friends of mine who write cosmic horror, and absolutely in their own version of whatever mythos they're working in, whether it's one that's established or one of their own, they know how it works because they have to know how it works. So the reader and the characters trapped in that story, so their world is consistent. So, and the horror's consistent in that story and the terror is consistent. But again, it is all those level of explanations. And you can have very hard fantasy that has, exactly how a magic system works in the same way as you can have high science fiction in the way how a warp engine works. And I think, again, it all depends on the background, I think, listening to this conversation, of the writer as well as the reader, and, and how much they have to explain, or they want to explain, telling the kind of story they wanted to tell.
Maddie, you mentioned in your work, and also I'm sure in your reading, examples of fantasy systems where the rules are explained versus more sort of loosey-goosey. What's your own approach, and what do you prefer as a reader and consumer?
So when I'm writing, when I start off writing, I need to have the freedom of being able to take the story whichever way the story needs to be. So I found that I can't decide at the beginning whether I'm writing something that's going to be more fantasy orientated or more sci-fi, because I just find that too limiting. And then I find that I'm trying to write within like a category, and I just end up sort of shoehorning it into a direction that doesn't feel natural. So I wait until I've sort of pretty much written a whole draft before I then know what the story is, the shape of the story, and then I start sort of thinking about how it might be classified. But yeah, when I was first querying agents, and I was like I remember when I was editing my manuscript and I was worrying, oh, is it fantasy, is it science fiction, is it dystopian, how do I define it? And I got so caught up on like the definitions that I just wasn't finding it helpful, and I was finding it really limiting when I was still editing my story at that stage, because then I was thinking, oh well, maybe I need to make it more sci-fi, or maybe I need to go more fantasy. So yeah, I definitely think that the labels are more beneficial for readers in terms of them sort of setting up the correct expectations for what they want to read. But yeah, I think plausibility is at the heart of the world building for anything science fiction or fantasy. And with fantasy, I think you get more leeway because readers go into that knowing that it's not going to be sort of like 100% science fiction, like accurate. But yeah, you do still have to stick to the rules that you've created when you're writing fantasy, and be sort of like consistent within that. And yeah, like I think that's really important, just to be consistent within the world and to write as if it is absolutely real, because it will be to your characters. So, and like readers will be able to tell if it's not, or if there are any inconsistencies. But yeah, I like writing fantasy because I like being in complete control of the world, and like if I need something to happen that couldn't technically happen in real life, I can find a way to make it happen without having to go deep into the science of it.
Thanks. Sorry, I had a brief technical difficulty. Darren, how about you? What are your thoughts on this?
I think a lot of it also bases on the perspective of the character, and I'd agree it's more of a marketing thing to put it in what genre it's in. But you know, the reader starts out with a certain perspective, so you know, I could compare my series with Actaeon, the engineer, who's in this seemingly fantasy world trying to figure out all these different artifacts and how do they work and why are they there. And the further he gets along, the more he realizes, hey, there's a scientific explanation behind this. This world might, you know, all these big buildings like this pyramid had some sort of purpose, and you know, I could try to figure that out, and he could speculate on it. Maybe he doesn't really know. Or you could go to like Brian Aldiss wrote a book called Nonstop, where the character starts out seeming like he's in a fantasy world with this unique culture, and then he gradually realizes, oh, I'm on a spaceship, which, you know, I definitely encourage you to read that book. That's a pretty short read, but it's awesome. It turns from fantasy to sci-fi. The characters don't know anything, which is more of a fantasy perspective, and then suddenly they know more and more and more, and it gets towards sci-fi, right? But then you go the other way, like I was saying with the Expanse, right? James Holden, right, and the other characters that we like in the Expanse, if you've watched that or read the books, they know everything, right? They know how spaceships work. You need to you know, spin around to thrust in the opposite direction to decelerate, you know, towards a planet, and you know how to enter orbits and all of that stuff, and it's all explained. And then they gradually, as the series goes on, as at least I'm not done with it yet, but it's getting into the point where they don't know anything. They've discovered this protomolecule, and this protomolecule can do all these magical things and communicate across vast distances. And that ties into, again, that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think it's scaring a lot of these rational engineers that are, you know, the pilots of, you know, the engineer of the Rocinante, and she's like, I don't understand how any of this could work. It doesn't make sense. So it's sort of going into a fantasy novel, but the beginning perspective of those characters is science fiction, right? And the beginning perspective of, say, the engineer and Nonstop, and the Dying Earth is more fantasy, right? So I guess those books would do better if you marketed that, because if I try to say, okay, the engineer is hard sci-fi, and they read it and they go, well, these people are throwing spears at each other, what is going on? The readers could be very disappointed in that. Same thing with the Expanse. You're not going to say this is a fantasy, and people go, oh, I want to read a book about dragons and inexplicable things and escape, and now I'm reading about politics between Earth and Mars, you know. So
it can be tough. Joyce, how about you? Do you have thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, definitely. Let me take it from the perspective of my own series that starts out like a typical fantasy with a feudal society with a wizard, but the wizard himself teaches the boys that the magic that he teaches them has a scientific explanation. So it starts veering from the very beginning from fantasy into science fiction. And by the second book, where they find out that some catastrophe had happened in their world 1,000 years earlier that had destroyed all technology. And then they find people who are trying to rebuild the technology. And so it runs that gamut and continues that all the way through the book.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I think that books like that, books like the ones that Darren mentioned, I especially love The Expanse. I think they're more interesting because they do have aspects of both.
They
And
challenge
I
your
think that
perspective.
yeah, and
Yeah.
if it's done well, then it really keeps the reader with it all the way through. The biggest problem is that booksellers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, they want you to put your book in one or the other.
Yeah.
And they don't have a science fantasy category.
They don't. I can speak for myself. My books, because I have alien, quote unquote, aliens in them, and they're set on a lost colony. Amazon has classified my books as colonization fiction, and also like alien invasion or something like that. There's some sort of subcategories that my books have been put into by Amazon, which I'm like, no, it's like people who are going to be looking for stories about people actually settling planets and the work of doing that kind of that sort of thing are not going to like my books, which again are more like McCaffrey's Dragonflight, where the people are the colony is well established for thousands of years, and most of the people don't even remember that they came from Earth, except for a small subset of the population. And so like the problems are much more like fantasy problems rather than like where it's a brave new world and we're colonizing this territory kinds of problems. So I always worry that like that sort of misclassification is not helpful to me personally, but it is sometimes a challenge. And I know McCaffrey herself, always said the Pern books are science fiction, they're not fantasy. And I think that's true because there's no magic in those books at all.
But then the readers don't accept that because it's about their perspective, right?
Right. The readers see a dragon and they're like, oh, it's fantasy. It's a fire-breathing dragon too. But the fact is that dragon was genetically created by the original settlers. Is sort of and it's true that you don't get that in the early books. It's something that you learn later. Yeah. But still, I know as a teenager, those books were hugely inspirational to me because I loved it. I loved that there was that cross-pollination and then it was like kind of like, whoa, it blows my mind. It's, you think it's one thing and it turns out to be another thing. And I still get really, really excited when I'm reading a fantasy and I see like little elements of science fiction, like in Wheel of Time, which is set in future Earth. It's like you get like those elements, those bites of like the distant history and also the distant future where there is high tech in that world, but then most of the story is set in this sort of very sort of like medieval level of technology and so forth. So I think that those are good things. I have a question about the world building in terms of you're writing fantasy or you're writing science fiction, do you think that readers are more or less forgiving of fantasy authors or science fiction authors if the world building isn't as tight? Which do you think that there's a genre that allows for more space for that, or is it kind of again more up to the reader? So I see Joyce is nodding her head, so I'm going to ask Joyce that question first.
Yeah, I think you have a little bit more leeway with fantasy because you you expect the entire world to be different. Whereas in science fiction, most readers expect a touch of what our world is like right now. And so even if you've built a world that takes place in the future or even in the past, they expect some grounding in what Earth is like, what people are like on Earth, as opposed to, I don't know, a completely different world with dragons, with other creatures, with a mystical system, a magical system at work.
Darren, did you have a comment?
Yeah. Yeah, I think again, it kind of goes back to the perspective of the character. And I would agree with Joyce to say that in general, fantasy readers are a little bit more forgiving when it comes to world building. But, you know, I'm writing in more of a fantasy world here with my main character being an engineer, with an engineer's perspective. And I imagine an engineer or a scientist, when a reader's reading their perspective, they want the full explanation as they discover it. They're not going to accept the glossed over explanation from a character that's looking that deep into something. So they want to see that fully fleshed out background. They want to see as that character starts to analyze these different parts, that it makes sense. So like, for example, in the Redemption universe, I have Actaeon and his friends. They encounter these death crawler creatures, which are like giant house centipedes that are crawling through the underground underneath the pyramid. And they're these fantasy monsters basically, but Actaeon has to defeat them, and he's not, you know, he's an engineer, he's not going to fight them. So he's got to try to figure out scientifically how to destroy them. And the readers, I think, follow those explanations. Then they want to know, well, okay, he caught it. It's vulnerable to this. This is how it works when he dissects it. They want to see that scientific explanation. And if I don't adequately explain that, even in a fantasy world through an engineer's perspective, they're not going to buy it. You know, they're going to say that doesn't make sense what he's doing. They want to see it nicely thought through. So I do think it's what perspective we write ourselves into. That's important. Like if you write, like I don't know who's read the Malazan series, for example, but if you have a chapter from the perspective of Quick Ben, who's you know, a master mage that knows all of the different warrens for the magic, you're not going to buy a glossed over explanation from him. He understands how all of the different magic systems work. You need to have that detail. So as an author, you need to have thought that out very well. Whereas if there's just a side character like Fiddler, for example, he's not going to understand the magic at all, and the reader's going to buy that because he's just a guy that blows things up. So,
Alex, how about you? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with Darren. I think it's how deep as an author you dig yourself in, and if you dig yourself in, then you better be ready to climb out of that hole you've dug yourself into. I mean, obviously, you need to provide, whether it's a magic system or a scientific technological system, you need to provide some explanation. But if you start going with a magic system, as Darren said, really deep into explanation of how it works, even borderline scientific in the explanation of it. I know like Sanderson does a good, like, goes pretty deep into it. Then you see readers all the time arguing. You see like a higher incidence of readers arguing of whether it would be possible. And we're talking magic here, but if you get more quote unquote, scientific about your magic system, again, you better be ready to back it up. But whereas if you touch on things, explain things, and I think this goes on I mean, hard science fiction is one thing because you're dealing with specialists in the real world that are going to bring their view and their expertise into your view. So I do agree that you're starting handicapped on the science fiction side, especially hard science fiction, because you have real world experts. But on the other side of it, you have people that are magic experts, or at least think they might be, that are going to tear apart your magic system. So I do think it's about how deep you get yourself into it.
In engineering, we call those boundary conditions. So the more you create, the more difficult it is to fit, other possibilities into that set of boundary conditions. So, and you certainly do that with magic.
I'm going to put Cavan on the spot. How does the sonic screwdriver work?
It's a magic wand. Okay, it does whatever you want it to do because it has a setting that binds concrete back together.
If you want, I'll figure out a way to make it work.
Well, that's the thing. What I love about all these worlds and the worlds I've ended up working in is the fact that you do have the technical manual for the Enterprise. You have or you have the technical manual for the TARDIS, and yeah, there will be the kind of fan who wants to know how the sonic works, and there's also the kind of fan who just goes, it gets him out of a room or her out of a room really quickly, which is very interesting. The sonic came back with the new series because the episodes were shorter, and so they couldn't spend so long with the Doctor being locked in a room, whereas in the 80s he could be locked in the room for weeks. But when you've only got 45 minutes to tell a story, you need a tool to get you out of it. It's the same for any of these things. What I really liked was the thought then that it is the competency of your characters that make it believable. I mentioned the Enterprise there, and again, the Enterprise, it's a space opera, it's on TV. When you get into the novels, I think you get more hard science fiction with Star Trek. On TV, there's a lot of technobabble, there's a lot of things that sound like they could be plausible, but it depends who's saying them. That's the important thing. If Spock or Scotty is saying them, you believe whatever comes out of their mouth. When McCoy says a bit about a medical bit of jargon that we've never heard of, because Dr. McCoy is a surgeon, and we've been told he's a surgeon, you believe him. And I think as a writer, you can create those characters because they're really good as well. When you have to change the rules later, that you can put something into their mouth and go, well, actually, of course, it does mean this. And everyone goes, oh, right, okay, fair enough. And you take a certain some part of the audience with you. Not everyone, though, because as soon as you add facts, people expect more facts, and they will know facts that you don't know.
The engineers and the scientists, right?
And historians.
And
I mean, we're talking about magic. In our world, not any fictional world, magic was science, and science was magic. That's where science came from alchemy and from the church. And again, that's sort of going into my theology and history background. There was a certain point in the 16th century where Queen Elizabeth had someone on a staff who was a spy, an alchemist, a magician, and a mathematician, and a scientist in John Dee. And he was the expert of all those things. And for him, they were all interchangeable. And so, yeah, both science and magic systems have to work like that because they come from the same basis.
I think there's a question here. I'm going to put it out. So does anyone find, first of all, I want to make the note that the Kids in Galaxy Quest has been brought up by Pam, one of the organizers. So, and I think that's a great example of that movie's great, where they have to call the kids on the phone and be like, we're in this room and there are these things going, the pistons going up and down. How do we get through it? And kids tell them the formula that they need to do to navigate through the pistons. So someone says, does anyone find either label helpful? Aren't subgenre labels like post-apocalyptic, with books being able to have them, more than one better for both authors and readers in setting expectations. So I think we talked about this a little bit, but yeah, setting the reader's expectations or the consumer's expectations when they go into a thing and they're expecting it to be science fiction or fantasy, and then it turns on a dime and gives them something else. I guess, are there any examples in your own minds when you've ever been disappointed, when you wanted something, when you were expecting something to be one or the other, or horror or something that falls into the speculative fiction umbrella, when you went into it expecting one thing and you got something else and you didn't think that it worked, you thought that, oh, that just didn't work. I don't know, anybody can take this one if you have any thoughts about an example where it didn't work.
I think more frequently for me, because I don't remember a lot of the examples where it doesn't work, but I think in a lot of cases, I see that, and when they take those tropes and they turn them on their head, it works better for me, actually. In the memorable cases where it's done right, it's kind of a hard thing to think about when it wasn't done right, because I just kind of put those out of the back of my head and forget about them. They don't sink in.
There's one I can think of. I was watching The 100 quite recently, and the first series is very much sort of like post-apocalyptic, very much survival orientated. And then suddenly in the later series, you've got like this whole shared simulation of a world, and it just suddenly seemed to like pop up out of nowhere because there was no indications of that in the earlier series. And it just suddenly felt that they'd taken the world building to like a whole different level suddenly. And I just found it really jarring because it did not match my expectations at all, especially doing it quite far into like the different seasons as well. So that's one that really stands out for me, where it really sort of like put me off the series a bit, because I had been really like invested in it until then, and then it just lost me.
Was it too much like the old Dallas trope of like, it was all a dream, and just kind of retconning it, into something that it wasn't?
Yeah, like for me, the whole series had been very much about survival and sort of like on an individual basis, and it was very much character driven. And then that just changed it all, and it felt it was suddenly becoming plot driven. But it just made the whole thing seem rather unrealistic, and I wasn't invested as much in it. And like I didn't even watch the series after that because I'd sort of like felt a bit let down, where like my expectations didn't match up with what I was then being given. And I thought it was quite a risk that they took, changing the sort of the world and the world building at quite a late stage as well. So I was quite surprised by that, because I was like analysing from a writer's point of view as well, and that really surprised me.
Yeah, I thought that show was really well done from a craft perspective, from the idea of like, having a really good hook at the end of every episode that dragged you on into the next episode, and was a very good exploration of the consequences of your choices. And from a science perspective, I'm sort of, my expertise is more in biology, and so I tend to get like really like, that's not really possible. And so I do it with Star Trek, and I do it with the 100, the whole plot line they had with everybody having radiation poisoning and surviving radiation poisoning. And I'm like, so many problems with it that but you have to just suspend your disbelief and say, okay.
That's when, sorry.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, that's when the real world was crashing in. And I think I've got an example of this, that years ago, Christmas Day, watching the Doctor Who Christmas special with my mum, who does not watch science fiction or fancy or anything. And the entire family was sitting down watching it. And there's this entire sequence when the TARDIS comes spinning in and it's chasing a car that's going up the motorway. And she was buying all of this, and the Doctor's hanging out of the door and it's bigger on the inside. And then he asks for the assistant to jump from a moving car into the police box that mum has just seen spinning over bridges and banging into things and being shot at by robots. And at that point she went, oh, as if, because she couldn't accept that someone would jump from one moving vehicle onto another, but it could accept everything else because that was the world and that's what she was presented with. But then it crashed into her own world of actually she can't imagine someone doing that on the motorway, you know. And I think that's when we have those moments, when it's something we know and we're passionate about, that then it breaks down that way, that act of you know, suspending your disbelief, because it just smacks you in the face with going, no, this isn't real, you know, it's just made up, don't you? And I think that's the point. You go, oh yeah, it is, and things can start to unravel. So from a writer's point of view, you've got to be really careful how you do it. And I think for what Madeline was saying, it's the consistency as well. When you have those rug pulls, you need to do it from the basis of, well, that could happen within this world. You know, I think back to what would have happened if Empire Strikes Back had come out, if Twitter was around then, and people were saying, what, Luke can move things with his mind now, can he? Because that's not in the first film. But then you can go back and sort of say, well, it's sort of within the same realms of believability, that there's ghosts and you can move things and that kind of thing. But yeah, you have to you as a writer, I think you have to have that responsibility of going, I want to introduce this. Can that exist in the world I've already explored? And if not, perhaps it's a new world you need to create to tell that story.
That's a really interesting idea.
I actually thought of a really good example when you have a moment.
Well, go ahead.
Ascension. I don't know if any of you remember it. That was a TV series from, I think it was just one season, a few years back. That was a really great example for me of, this is a hopeful colony ship where all these people are going to colonize a new world, and they're on this beautiful spaceship, and they're having all these interesting interactions on the spaceship and some issues with it. And then the last show, without any foreshadowing, it was just a psychological experiment. They all, you know, it zooms out and there's people watching them, and they pull one of the people off the ship, and that was not advertised at all for what it was going to be. And it just felt like, as a consumer of science fiction fantasy, felt like a huge smack in the face, because they didn't advertise that was what I was looking for. I wanted a colony show. And then they suddenly turn around and go, no, you're in a psychological thriller.
That's a great short story. You know, that's kind of, you've invested, you know, a short story, reading a short story, and have that sort of twist at the end. When you invest an entire TV show and weeks, or
a whole season.
These days, these days a day if you're watching on Netflix. But you know, you've still invested time in it, and then to have, and again, that's the thing that people get angry about. I've invested time in this.
So if you have a slow exploration, like where you're learning, okay, there's scientific explanations behind a fantasy, that's not disappointing. But if you suddenly turn around and say, well, they were just in a simulation the whole time, right at the end, without even alluding to it.
Yeah, for me, that's, I actually just thought of a big show that kind of did it for me. I don't know if you guys agree, but Lost.
Yes,
I thought, I love everyone loves Lost. In the first 3 seasons, they really pushed hard on making you think of scientific explanations, and you were living in that world that they created. And then again, I know there's different interpretations of the ending, but I felt so let down, because I thought they went, I guess, totally out of the purview of any sort of scientific explanation. And I was just, that for me, that was a big one.
Yeah, you're just all in purgatory, and it's in your
exactly. If that's what it truly was,
then what a disappointment.
Right.
That was definitely, I would agree with you. I think that's a great example.
And I think this is an example of, like, it's the consumer who kind of decides, because I loved the end of Lost. So I thought it was very moving. It was very emotional for me. That was one of those shows that there was a moment in the 3rd or 4th season where I got lost, and my husband and I actually stopped watching it altogether. We were like, and we gave up. And then, you know, I picked it up again, because I watch things while I'm on the stationary bike, and I picked it up again, and it just, like, a couple of episodes past the point where we had given up, I got hooked again, and then it just carried me all the way through. And maybe it's because I had that break that actually lasted several years, and I didn't actually go back and rewatch from the beginning. I just picked up, and maybe that made the difference for me personally. But I know a lot of people, like, feel really let down by the last episode of Lost. Another example of that, Battlestar Galactica also took a mystical turn, and and a lot of people like really didn't like this series finale, which I loved. I loved the series finale of Battlestar Galactica, and I'm talking about the 2000s version, not the.
I think what it is it turns something that hooks the reader. Like for Lost, it was what's on that island. What are the explanations behind what's on that island?
Yeah.
What's down below the hatch? What's the purpose behind it? What will the island do if they don't hit that? All these things that they keep hooking the viewers with. And then I think when that ending tells you, well, that didn't matter.
Yeah.
And that is what's
Exactly.
frustrating. Battlestar Galactica is a little bit different because it is a twist ending, but it's not so, it doesn't really tell you that their journey doesn't matter. Because I think it still did. I think it did matter how they got there and that they did get there.
It's interesting because there was a series called over here called Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes, which is it's really hard to describe, and I'm probably going to blow the ending, which is pretty bad. But it's a cop in the modern day has an accident and ends up in the 1970s, and then somehow ends up in the 1980s, and again, the ending is very similar to spoilers, very similar to Lost, but really works because the way they've written it. And again, it's that consistency, and and I do wonder sometimes with some of the mystery box of Lost whether the ending was actually the ending they planned, and whether it's a way they were going one way and then went another way. Whereas with Ashes and Ashes and Life on Mars, it felt like actually when you go back and watch it again after seeing the ending, you see all the things that are linking throughout to that final scene, and you go, well, no, that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah.
But it could also have been a time travel show. It could have been all kinds of things.
Yeah, that also showed here, and I felt the same way.
Yeah.
If that's a question that you're not sure about what's going on right in the beginning, like I guess Thomas Covenant, right, is a good example. Thomas Covenant, the whole time the recurring theme through that series is it in his mind, or is he really in this land? That, or and that's a big question, especially for the first 3 books, and there's constant allusions to that as you go throughout. So if Donaldson was to turn around and say, well, no, he wasn't there the whole time, I don't think the reader would have been that furious about it, because leading up to it, it was kind of hinted at, hey, it might be.
Right. Yeah.
It's what you're promised, isn't it? I think that's what we're saying. It's what you're promised at the beginning. You have to make sure that you live to that promise, and you can take it wherever you're going and wherever you want to bring into it. You're the creator. It's your world. That's the whole point of being a creator. But again, you have to remember the promise that people had, that you gave people when they picked the book up.
Yeah, you're making people promises that they're going to understand the explanations behind various things. And if you just tell them, well, hey, that thing that I've been hooking you along through 300 pages of my book, well, that doesn't matter anymore. And that's the ending. Surprise. They're just not going to like you at the end of that.
Yeah.
Good point. And you know what? I think we're getting really close to the end of our time. You guys have been a great panel. This is one of my favorite topics. I love to discuss this, and where the distinctions lie. And I personally love all forms of speculative fiction that sort of bridge these gaps and bring everything together, which is why most of the things that Cavan has worked on in my life, in his life, I have really enjoyed. So anyhow, and I can't really see it, but I am wearing my Avengers t-shirt because the Avengers, I think, is a good example of something that brings together the fantasy elements and the science fiction elements.
I was going to mention comics, because comics are probably one of the only subgenres where you can have fantasy and science fiction standing next to each other, literally, in the case of Batman and Superman, because Superman isn't science fiction at all, he's a god. And again, it's the thing about trappings, and you can have those characters in a group and you can absolutely believe that they all work in the same world, because again, the way it's grown, I don't think it was ever, neither of the big 2 comic universes, I don't think they didn't plan to, because it's an evolving thing with lots of different creators. But yeah, I mean, when you've got the fact Thor is a god and also he's an alien, it absolutely works, and you believe it because everyone in the world believes it too. And I think again, it's the competence of the characters you create and the beliefs of the characters you create and how believable that is that's important to sell
Yeah,
anything.
touching just enough on reality to make it seem plausible. Right?
Hmm.
All right,
Yeah.
we've just about 30 seconds left. So I need to thank all of the panelists. You've all been terrific. I
Thank
want to
you.
remind viewers to
Thank
go
you,
to
yeah.
DarrenCon2020.com for the full schedule, the Artists Alley. Also, coming up, we have a reading at, shoot, nothing is working. Okay, coming up, we have a reading with Daniel Kelly at 4:30 Eastern time. So please come back for that and keep an eye on the schedule. And everybody have a great day. And it's been lovely talking to all you guys.
Thank you.
Take care,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you,
Nice
everyone.
meeting you all.